Welcome back to History 104. In this lecture, we will talk about the 1920s. Uh, Part of the goal is to kind of explore what were some of the transformations that were taking shape in this decade, and also kind of challenge some of the perceptions that we might have of this period. So typically, this is a period that's perceived as a time of prosperity, a time of jazz, a time of freedom for many groups, particularly women. And we're going to examine and kind of address whether this is actually true. So we're going to look at economic policy, acculturation, and also address jazz. As this pictures kind of show, right, we have this kind of jazz culture here, people dancing, having a good time, which is typically the way the 1920s is presented with prohibition and so forth. And we're going to see if this really impacted the majority of people, right? We're going to kind of question that. We're also going to see how ethnic migrants are impacted by this period. Typically, many people are taught that this is an era where many of your ancestors who migrated at the turn of the century became American in the 1920s through this kind of consumer driven culture. And we're definitely going to challenge that argument. And then finally down here you see a picture of a jazz band, and we're going to address how jazz plays a role in this era, but we're going to also touch on the issue of race. So these are the objectives for this lesson. So as I noted a second ago, one kind of key argument here, really an overriding theme, is that things were not really that great for your average American citizen. And that's the key. So by no means do I want to argue that these things did not happen, right? The jazz and the prohibition and people drinking and having a good time. But I definitely want to show you that this really didn't impact the majority of people. So a lot of times there were very kind of selective stories that were told in the 1920s to present this image of the way this era is presented, right? So we're going to kind of look at how your average American, I don't know, not even average American, but average person living in America was impacted by this decade. So one kind of key focus is looking at supply side economics. This is a economic theory that is probably taught in your economic classes. It's a system that never really works. It's a great theoretical concept, but has never really come into fruition. It was somewhat successful in the 1920s, but again, we're going to tie it back to this overall argument. Did supply side economics benefit working class people living in the United States? Number two, we're going to look at working class migrants. So as I mentioned earlier, typically it's presented that this is the era where they assimilated in the 1920s. And we're going to challenge that argument by looking at historical sources and data and so forth to see how much of an impact it had on migrant communities. Number three, as I just mentioned, right, that this kind of consumer culture impacted different communities. And yes, there was some consumerism taking shape, but did this help create this kind of national American identity through this consumer culture? So again, we'll examine that. One place where you can kind of see this impact is the way it impacted women, but even then it's complicated. So we'll look at flapper culture, looking at it through the lens of Mexican American women, and to see the impact it had on their daily experiences. And another group of women that we'll touch on are women of the KKK, because it is kind of very fascinating as to how they take the progress that women have made right throughout the decades, particularly the early 1900s, with suffrage, right, with the ability to vote, and they begin to kind of use these tools of voting to kind of go against kind of feminist ideology. So these women become the anti-feminists of the period, and it's a fascinating look into this organization. Typically, we talk about the male version of the KKK, and the book touches on that. But here, I want to focus on women of the KKK because their approach on addressing some of these issues is an approach that we still see today. So even though they're kind of benefiting from feminist ideology, they're actually trying to work against it and kind of do away with it. They believe that women belong in the home and so forth. So, we'll address their ideology. And then lastly, we're going to touch on race and music, focusing on jazz, right? Jazz really kind of defines this era. And we're going to examine, was everybody listening to jazz? Well, yeah, yes and no, right? People had problems with it. And only when it gets co opted are people all of a sudden feeling comfortable with it. So if you're ready, let's get started. So let's begin by looking at the presidency in the 1920s. This will set the tone for the decade, and I kind of want to add to what the book addresses, and give you a little bit more context as to how the 1920s developed and also kind of challenge these perceptions that we have of this era. As you can see in the title, it says this is a business country and it wants a business government. So what we see is a shift from the progressive era to the 1920s, which is focused really on the relationship between business and government. So one thing I want to do is to start with is by addressing that in the 1920s, terms like Republican and Democrat did not mean what they mean today. So do not confuse modern political affiliation with historical parties. If anything, these terms, such as Republican and Democrat, meant something very different. As you may recall from the previous chapter, the Progressive Era, as many progressives came from both parties, along with other political affiliation. So it's not fair to kind of associate, looking at history through today's lens and trying to draw some kind of parallels with what's happening today. So be careful with using such terminology, particularly political affiliation, because political party is different from political ideology or political philosophy. So let's begin by focusing on the presidency of Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge and add a bit more context to their presidency so we can examine how the 1920s obtained its moniker of the Roaring Twenties. Though the book provides some good information regarding their presidency and the scandals that haunted Harding, I want to focus on fiscal policy as it will set the tone for the era along with influencing future presidents, particularly in the 1980s, who attempted to emulate Harding's policies with little success. First, we must address the late teens and the impact it had on the 1920s policies. There is a consensus among historians that Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge were some of the most forgettable presidents in American history. And there is validity in those statements, even though many revisionist historians have reassessed their presidency and praised both their character along with their foresight. However, we will explore both the positive and negative impact such policies had on both the economy and the American people. Many of you might be familiar with the economic theory of supply side economics, particularly if you were alive in the 1980s during the Reagan administration. Though Reagan was influenced by Harding and Coolidge's economic plan, there were some major differences as to how these two different eras implemented it. For the sake of this lecture, I will focus on the 1920s and save Reagan's failure for later in the semester. First, let's address what were some things that Harding inherited as president. Like any president that encounters a major political shift, Harding was a reactionist against changes that emerged from the 1900s to the 1920s, specifically the progressive era that tried to reform, specifically the progressive era reforms that impacted business. As you may recall, the progressive era helped address things like clean water, food safety, infrastructure spending, etc., which cost money. Hence, the passage of the 16th Amendment, which allowed the federal government to collect income taxes to pay for some of these reforms. That same year, in 1913, Congress ratified the Federal Reserve Act, creating a central bank, thus allowing the federal government to impact the economy through monetary policy. Though, to some, this might seem as big government, quote unquote, we must recognize that society was becoming more complex and needed these changes and institutions for a modern economy. As you read, new cultural and technological shifts were taking shape as, for the first time in US history, most people lived in urban spaces in cities rather than in the country. Radio, movies, automobiles, electricity, airplanes, supermarkets, such as the Piggly Wiggly, which came out in 1916, were changing the landscape of the US, so new laws and regulations needed to be implemented to address the chaos that these innovations were creating. However, the most significant were automobiles, where we saw production increase from 2.3 million to 3.8 million in annual production, and total registrations rose from 12.3 to 24.7 million vehicles between 1922 and 1928. Thus, for many, this meant that a larger state was needed to help address these changes, right? A bigger government, right? Because somebody needed to regulate all these, all this new technology. Another factor that impacted Harding was World War I. Though the US had minimal participation in the event, it did shift our economy into a war economy and cause a major deficit because much of it was financed through borrowing, causing the national debt to balloon from 1.2 billion in 1916 to 25.5 billion by 1919. In addition, with the war over, the economy needed to return to a consumer-based economy, along with dealing with the influx of labor caused by returning WW1 soldiers, thus creating a high rate of unemployment of 11.3% and causing GDP to fall to 74 billion, which was about 15% drop from the previous year. Most people have seen Harding as an inept for the position of president. The National Experience, a newspaper at the time, depicted Harding as a, quote, handsome, semi-educated political hack with a modest taste for golf, a larger taste for women, liquor, and poker, and a complacent disposition, an utterly empty mind, and an enduring loyalty to the Republican creed of 1890, unquote. He was seen as easily controlled by his wife for her own ambitions, while controlled by Harry Daugherty throughout his presidency, quote, like a green girl at a country fair, unquote, where the weak Ohioan had been seduced by men, quote, cleverer and more sinister than himself, unquote. In addition, he had multiple extramarital affairs, a child out of wedlock, and constantly drank in the White House. Remember that this is during the age of Prohibition, going against the policies. The issue then becomes, is this a fair assessment of Harding? Most would still agree that it is, and if it wasn't for his death in office, he might have been implicated and impeached due to the scandals such as the Teapot Dome scandal. As one person noted, quote, he looked presidential, unquote, which isn't saying much. But let's examine his presidency and see the impact that he had in this decade of decadence. As the textbook noted, Harding won by the biggest landslide in history of 404 to 127 in the Electoral College, and he also won in the popular vote. In addition, Republicans also controlled both the Senate and the House, allowing the president to pass legislation without much conflict. To this extent, one can argue that there was real economic success, which reflects the way we see the period of the 1920s. GDP increased, wages rose, unemployment rate fell, and income tax rates were lowered, along with federal costs were reduced, thus shrinking the national debt. Harding implemented a business model to government with his cabinet full of businessmen, applying private sector practices such as passing rules for salary increases within government, which were tied to performance. Within a few years that he was in office, he was able to shrink the deficit from 24.3 billion to 22.3 billion, had a revenue surplus for 3 consecutive years, and annual expenditures, which means the cost of running government essentially, were reduced from 6.4 billion in 1920 to 3.1 billion by 1923, cutting it by half. In other words, the economy was heading in the right direction, but much of it had to do with fiscal responsibility by cutting as much as possible, and then working towards erasing the national debt and supporting businesses, which helped create a consumer culture. After the death of Harding, his VP Calvin Coolidge took the helm and followed the policies of his predecessor. Calvin Coolidge was a man of few words and, as noted earlier, was not well remembered. His policies were shaped by his Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, which focused on supply-side economic policies such as deregulation of government control over businesses, cutting government costs, national debt reduction, and major tax cuts. These policies were heavily influenced by the National Association of Manufacturers and the Chamber of Commerce, all business organizations, two pro-business organizations. Unlike Harding, Coolidge was essentially turning the reign of government to businesses, and the theory was that if government plays a minimum role, then it would, quote, promote a maximum amount of individual freedom, which in turn would unleash productive, entrepreneurial, and innovational activities to the advantage of all, unquote, which in other words meant that it would, quote unquote, trickle down to the masses. However, history has shown us that this is not true. Their economic theory was grounded in the belief that regulations hurt the status of a nation and of people, so the less the better. Second, government must comprehend that businesses know what is best for the nation state. Third, government can intervene, but only to regulate labor organizations such as unions, because they were seen as a real threat to society. Understand that unions created the middle class later in the 1950s. And lastly, a successful business reflected the expertise and science of the age, thus providing that they knew best and businessmen should take positions of government. As you can see, these business organizations such as the National Association of Manufacturers and the Chamber of Commerce were making the case that government needed to be run like a well-oiled business machine, not taking into account that businesses fail all the time, as we will see in the next chapter. In fact, the mantra of the 1920s was, quote, the man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. And to each is due not scorn and blame, but reverence and praise, unquote. This quote highlights that the 1920s reflected the triumph of business and efficiency over God and faith. Thus, the Ford Company was the new modern church where people worship both goods and wealth. So let's examine Coolidge's policies, which were directed by Andrew Mellon, who really ran the show. During World War I, taxes needed to be raised in order to fund the war, as the government borrowed to pay for the war, but by the 1920s, the US felt isolated and safe, so Mellon pushed to lower taxes in order to help increase tax revenue and help businesses because the belief was that the lower tax rates would generate higher tax revenue, thus reducing taxes for the upper income classes. That's that kind of supply-side economics. That the theory is that people have more money, thus they're going to spend more, creating more tax revenue. Again, it's a theory that has never really come into fruition. In fact, the Mellon Plan in 1928, as it became known, lowered the tax rate from 50% to 25%, saving someone like Mellon about $600,000 to $800,000 per year. Now, this percentage was really for the upper class. So this is for the top classes. while the lower classes had theirs lowered from 4% to 3%. Right? Not much. In addition, taxes on excessive profits and gift taxes were repealed, which typically benefited the upper classes, right? These are the classes that have the money to pass from generation to generation. So they don't have to pay taxes on things like gift tax, on gifts and excessive profits. Though some prosperity did somewhat trickle down, much of the wealth was concentrated at the top. When it came to paying World War I vets the bonuses that they were promised, so this is like a really important story. After World War I, right, they were promised these bonuses. Both Harding and Coolidge stopped any legislation on that matter. In fact, in 1921, Harding argued that it was fiscally irresponsible to pay the bonuses that were promised, as it would be, quote, detrimental to economic recovery, unquote, even though it had popular support. However, they had no problem helping the business classes with tax cuts. A year later, Congress passed another bonus army bill, and Harding vetoed it. When Coolidge took office, he quickly shut down any hope for the soldiers' bonus bill and vetoed it in 1924. So these people that were promised this money never got it. And next chapter, you'll see what happens to this bonus army situation. Farmers fared no better as they could not compete with cheaper agricultural goods from other parts of the world. And even with tariffs, their real income decreased. So we just looked at the role that government had in the 1920s and really focused on fiscal policy. Now I want to focus on the working class and how they were impacted by the 1920s. Typically, it's presented as a period where everybody benefited, right? Again, that trickle-down theory. And we're going to see something very different, all right? So this slide, as you can see, it's called Working to be Poor. So as you have seen, the macro institutions were set in order for certain classes to benefit from the relationship between government and business. But how did this impact the average American worker? In addition, who are we talking about when we talk about, quote unquote, the worker? Are they white, black, Asian, Latino, ethnic white, immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe who still retain many of their cultural background from their patria? And how did it shape their attitudes towards the nation state? In this section, we will explore the impact of the 1920s on your average person. For the most part, we will focus on Chicago because we have a large collection of data due to the amount of researchers, such as anthropologists, social workers, sociologists, ethnographers, etc., that were localized there, such as in Hull House, along with the major universities there. In addition, Chicago had one of the most diverse ethnic communities in the US, with Polish, Czech, Swedish, Jewish, Italians, Greeks, African Americans from the South, Irish, Mexicans were even there in the 1920s, and white quote-unquote hillbillies that had recently migrated to this urban jungle. One would assume that this plethora of diversity would help create the infamous concept of the melting pot, or as one scholar has defined it, the quote, national consumption community, unquote, that was seeking the mythical American dream, as most of us have been taught from grade school, particularly in this period. So, in this section, those stories that you have been taught about assimilation between the 1900s to 1930s are more myth than reality. In fact, what we will see in this section is that the story is much more complicated, or at the very least, the American dream myth has been highly fabricated and exaggerated by newspapers and magazines of that era, such as the magazine True Story, which embellished these anecdotal examples in order to increase a middle class consumption, right? So they create this idea of the American dream, even though most people did not participate in it. When examining the idea of the quote-unquote worker in the 1920s, we tend to group them with many different classes because we assume that the prosperity of the era cut across all economic classes. In fact, the middle class average uh, sorry, in fact, the middle class average about less than 20% of the US population, and most workers, about 60%, made less than $2,500 in 1929, which was considered the poverty line, while 40% made less than 1,500. So then why do we present the 1920s as a time of prosperity if your average American could not even make ends meet, right? Maybe because we contrast that with the Great Depression. There were attempts to create safety nets by employers. However, these were few and far between. Other industrialized economies, really other European countries, had already implemented certain worker benefits at the state level, such as disability, sickness, and industrial accident benefits in places like Germany and England, which dated back to the 1870s. However, the US was not willing to provide such basic needs. Instead, the US relied on the business sector to institute these benefits, which were defined as welfare capitalism, because these benefits were provided by the employer rather than the state. In the 1920s, some, and I strongly emphasize that word some because not all companies could do this, attempted to provide some of these benefits. For the employer, to implement these benefits meant that it created better conditions for the workers. At least that's the theory, right? It provided extra income so the worker can spend, right, purchasing their goods, provided a safety net with a pension, and even allowed employees to own stock in the company, thus making a more loyal employee to the company and increasing productivity because his job and income were now tied to the success of the business. So again, businesses did not implement all these ideas, but maybe they would choose one or the other here and there. For the employee, they felt that they gained a voice in the company where they worked. Ultimately, welfare capitalism failed due to the small scope of such programs. First, only large companies or corporations could afford to implement such benefits, which meant that the majority of workers would not benefit from them. Many times, companies would dismiss the 8-hour workday and force workers to work 12-hour shifts. So it was against the law, right? Unemployment was already a threat that was just around the corner for many of these workers. So even with these benefits, they never felt secured in their job. And lastly, the ultimate goal of implementing welfare capitalism was really to eliminate unions at the workshop. So welfare capitalism was really about, quote, sustaining a power system that granted management full authority over the terms of employment, unquote. As you can see, companies were not really concerned with the welfare of their workers, but rather used these benefits to rein in their control over them. Remember that government wanted to stop unions, and here obviously companies wanted to stop unions too. Though unemployment was already volatile in the 1920s, workers continued to survive with the little that they made, thus challenging the common misconception that the 1920s was a time of economic upward mobility for your average worker. Add to this the hazardous working conditions that employees face due to the deregulation and even non-regulation of the era. One of the most infamous cases and a perfect case study of the rampant relationship between business, government, and the medical profession are the radium girls, who worked at a plant as dial painters where they painted luminous numbers on watches and instrument dials. There's actually a movie on, I think, Netflix that talks about their story. Because the dials were so minuscule, women, who were most of the employees and were well compensated, particularly as it was seen as a skilled job, would put a paintbrush with the radium luminous paint into their mouths so they could have a fine point so they could paint these dials. Unfortunately, what these women were consuming was the radioactive poison causing anemia and quote unquote jaw rot, which would ultimately lead to cancer and a slow death for many of them. To assume that these companies cared about the healthcare of their workers would be preposterous, as these companies worked with both the medical field along with government agencies to cover up or limit the access of their findings. In fact, many of these women were the daughters of poor immigrants, so they were seen as disposable since there was a labor surplus at the time. As word spread of their conditions, the company worked hard to blame other causes and even blame the women themselves for their ill health. Everything from phosphorus poison to syphilis were used as excuses to deflect blame from themselves. State investigations opened up in 1922, but their concerns focused on industrial accidents rather than industrial caused diseases. So, right, if a machine cut your hand or something like that, that's what government would investigate rather than these long-term diseases. So not much was accomplished. A chemist who did a chemical analysis of the company's product concluded that, quote, ingredients in the paint was dangerous as radium had a very violent action on the skin, and it is his belief that the serious conditions of the jaw had been caused by the influence of radium, unquote. However, the Labor Department took no action. By 1924, a Harvard team conducted research based on the growing literature of the dangers of radium and concluded that, quote, radium could be plated into bone and discovered that dust in the plant was radioactive, unquote. This led to concerns that inhaled radioactive dust was causing the doll painters anemias and jaw necrosis, unquote. When these findings were reported to the president of the company, he concluded that the Harvard study were, quote, tentative and based on circumstantial evidence, unquote, stating that it was his conclusion, remember he's not a medical expert, he's a business owner, that, quote, there is nothing harmful anywhere in the works, unquote. It would take another year until 1925 to release this Harvard study. However, the company fought tooth and nail to limit its access, even going as far as to argue that the study supported the company's claim. Ultimately, we find that the interests of the business sector surpassed the well-being of the worker, even when the state agencies or the medical profession got involved. For these radium girls, unfortunately, could not participate in the mass popular culture of the era, dressing as flappers or dancing the Charleston while listening to jazz, right? They did not have this luxury. As the Harding and Coolidge presidency had clearly articulated, business was the new god, and these women were the martyrs that fought to change such logic. So as you can see over here from a newspaper clip, it talks about some of the women that were dying from radium poison. And during this period, radium was such a important product that people were actually drinking it. It was mixed in with all this other stuff, and they thought it was like a miracle cure. So a lot of people were killing themselves. And again, a lot of this has to do with deregulation. As you can clearly see, the myth of prosperity might have trickled down, but the depths that it reached were very limited. When focusing in a much more micro level, we can get a better understanding of how the myth of American prosperity was constructed. First, let's look at the way the working class was impacted by these economic changes of the era. Though wages did increase, particularly after World War I, in the manufacturing industries such as steel, meatpacking, and the clothing industry, which were mostly unskilled and semi-skilled workers were in constant fear of losing their job throughout the era. Layoffs were common during slow seasons, making it difficult for workers to save enough money to have a safety net. Much has been written about how the 1920s represented a consumer-driven culture because workers had more money to spend. However, as indicated earlier, they could barely survive on what they earned, making it impossible to participate in the spending sprees that we associate with the era. It is important to note that many have argued that the 1920s represented a quote-unquote borrow for today mentality, where businesses instituted a credit system that allowed consumers to purchase goods and pay over time. However, this did not really impact the working class as much as we think, or we thought, right? Yes, consumer debt jumped from $7 billion annually, which was twice the federal budget, However, this was really a bourgeois exercise for those that were salaried and had expectations of higher incomes, unlike the industrial workers. Those workers that did purchase on credit tended to purchase small items rather than large durable goods. So let's examine the consumption of the working class and how it shaped their identity as they were living in an urban center like Chicago. So here you see some of the companies that emerge, right? Cars, Cadillacs. Who can afford a Cadillac back then? Certainly not the average worker. Even Model Ts, though they were more affordable. As I noted, your average worker was not making that much money. And then you also have the introduction of mass markets, like big supermarkets, which again I'll address in a little while. But here's an A&P. So let's look at the working class. Again, what did this mean in the 1920s? So many throughout history, and again, if you take a history class in K through 12, you typically learn about this melting pot theory, right? That immigrants came to America, they left their identity and they became American. So this slide deconstructs that myth of the melting pot theory. So, as historians, as noted, when we think of the 1920s, historians tend to focus on how this consumer culture dramatically changed ethnic communities in urban centers. The chapter that you read highlighted the many goods that were now available. In fact, it is highly believed that many of your great or grandparents came to the US at the turn of the century and quickly assimilated into American culture. Hence the melting pot, right? Utilizing mass material culture in order to do so. However, what research has found was that the opposite took place. And in this section, we will examine how products had little to minimal impact in the life of the industrial ethnic enclaves throughout the US, even though we will focus on Chicago specifically. Many scholars have noted the importance of the automobile and the way it changed the American landscape. Though in the big picture this is true, for most industrial workers in the 1920s, we find that few actually own cars, which was only about 3% of semi-skilled workers by 1924. Many lived by their work, so they would use mass public transportation rather than drive to work. And who could afford a car, right? Got to pay for gas and so forth. When they did consume items on credit, it wasn't to participate in American culture, but rather to maintain their own ethnic culture. Purchasing items such as a phonograph meant that they could bring a piece of Italy or a piece of Greece, Mexico, or Poland into their home, since the majority of the workers were immigrants. They played foreign language records which could be heard throughout the neighborhood, right? In places like Little Italy and so forth, right? These new products often made them nostalgic for home, so we see a growth in the recording industry by these ethnic migrants in order to meet this new demand. Even American industrial workers mimicked this nostalgia in urban centers, as Southern whites who lived and worked in the North longed for home and would listen to quote-unquote hillbilly music, while blacks who moved during the Great Migration purchased quote-unquote race records, which we will address later. Supermarkets, such as the A&P or Piggly Wiggly, were another place where the worker would battle to maintain their mother patria alive within the US. In the 1920s, we began to see a growth of supermarkets, quote unquote, and chain stores popping up throughout the American landscape. However, for the most part, many ethnic workers would not participate as consumers in these locations. First, many of these chains, such as the A&P, were located in above average economic communities. Think of something like Whole Foods, right? Which the working class did not reside in. Which again, a lot of poor people cannot afford Whole Foods. Most workers would go to their local mom and pop market, where they spoke the same language and provided a bit of small credit, which chain stores did not, so you needed plenty of cash if you were going to buy from them. These mom and pop businesses knew you by name. They came from the same region that you came from and had food that was recognizable to you, even if you had to pay a bit more to get it. It was something familiar and it was food that you actually ate. Only when forced would these ethnic migrants go to the supermarket to purchase goods, but it was to pick up products so they could make their ethnic dishes rather than consuming American culture. We see that today, right? We have many Mexican migrants here. We have a ranch market or food city, right? Food that is sold there is typically for these ethnic communities. We have a Ethiopian community here in Phoenix. They have their little markets, so not much has changed, right? The workers did not make much money. They were working less than their 19th century counterparts at times, and they did partake in the national pastime of going to the movies. However, this did not mean that the film industry had a major impact in creating a collective American culture. Like the music industry, many of these ethnic workers sought out films that reflected who they were and their identity. In fact, though struggling financially, workers always made it a point to save what they could so they could attend the theater. Local theaters tended to cater to the tastes of the community. Amateur nights showcased talent from the neighborhood, which were musicians or they did plays from the motherland, and the movies might have been short films from the region that they came from. Even silent films kind of convey this sense of ethnic pride, even though these movies were not about their mother country, because they were silent. Much of the conversation in the audience were in the native language of the community as they screamed and yelled at the screen. When it came to the radio, yes, people throughout the US were purchasing them since it was a cheap form of entertainment, but many workers could still not afford them. It has been noted that an average of 5 people listen to one radio, sometimes in a local store or a restaurant. We must remember that this was a new form of entertainment, so in the 1920s, there were no set of regulations by a national organization as to what could be played over the air. There were a few national stations, but for the majority of ethnic workers, they listened to what was familiar to them. They would tune in when news of their home country or religious narratives were presented. In fact, Benito Mussolini, the leader of Italy during this period, gave a radio address specifically to Italians living in America, thus connecting these migrants to their homeland. By 1926, stations started to carry ethnic programming throughout the day in order to meet this demand. So there was a quote unquote Polish and Irish hour where local musicians would go to the local station to perform a song, making them a celebrity for the day. Even Americans faced these obstacles of participating in mass consumer culture. For Mexicans and Mexican Americans, many were segregated into certain communities, and though they would attend certain halls and theaters, they were restricted to certain sections, such as the nosebleed areas, because European ethnic groups did not want to quote unquote mix. African Americans encountered much of the same type of racism, if not even worse. In Chicago, though it was much less restricted than the American South, they still had to walk a fine line. Due to such restrictions, the African American community were forced to create their own piece of America due to this racism. In the 1920s, African American people and leaders helped establish a separate quote unquote black economy out of necessity due to the racism in the city. Remember, they're not allowed to go to certain stores at this time. This black capitalism was nothing new, and we have heard of many examples, with the most notable one being in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as you may be aware of quote unquote Black Wall Street, where African Americans had black businesses and banks, and sustain an economic success story in the face of racial segregation and discrimination. In Chicago, it was difficult to recreate a Black Wall Street as capital was hard to obtain, or they might have lacked the business expertise or had limited resources, such as providing credit to their customers like other ethnic groups. However, there were success stories helping to create a small yet potent Black working middle class in certain industries, such as barbers and beauticians, cosmetic companies who sold straightening creams through nationwide chains, and even insurance salesmen. So you have a very, very small middle class of African Americans, but much of this had to do with creating their own economy, again, due to racism. And here you see some of the pictures, right? The Orpheum, where migrants would go watch movies or plays or whatever. Here you see some of the stores of small durable goods that they would buy, vacuum cleaners, right? Chairs, things that they could afford. So what we see in this slide really is that these ethnic communities are not really assimilating to American culture through mass consumer culture. Rather, they're trying to maintain their culture. So much has been said about the 1920s and flapper culture, right? When we think of the 1920s, there's certain things that pop up, and one of them is this idea of the flapper. So the book actually doesn't provides some information, but again, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper and look at really kind of like these deep ideas of what is flapperism in the context of this consumer culture. So in the last slide, you just heard about the minimal impact that consumer culture had on ethnic communities, right? Or on the industrial worker. I am now going to do a 180 and challenge that argument somewhat. All right, so we're going to do a 180 here. As you are well aware, history is complex, and there are no simple answers because we are social beings. However, what I'm going to focus on now is on the flapper culture and first-generation ethnic women who were coming of age in the 1920s. We will explore the impact of consumerism and how it changed them, while also continuing to examine the way families reacted, since many of these ethnic communities were concerned about the impact it had on their young daughters. These are not simple answers, but rather a complex, layered web of acculturation for many of these young women who had to make difficult decisions due to many factors, race being one of them. Again, the book addresses flappers along with women in general, and it does a really excellent job providing statistical facts about how the 1920s impacted them. As it argued, to some extent, women seem to continue to fight against that quote-unquote glass ceiling because opportunities did not open the way we have always thought. I would like to focus on how flapper culture impacted Mexican American women, since they were part of these ethnic communities and found something attractive to flapperism. For many throughout the world, flappers were modernity, challenging religious and traditional culture and sensibility. Thus, many families fought hard to limit its influence in their home. So this is a great example of like when you have immigrants come to the United States, their kids are growing up here and their kids are being introduced to American culture, and there's that kind of culture clash in the home. First, I want you to understand certain terminology, and then we will explore the impact it had on Mexican American women. Though know that many ethnic communities encounter some of these same experiences in this period. We begin by examining the idea of the modern woman versus the modern girl. All right, this is somewhat of an intellectual argument. All right, the modern woman was, quote, identified with social and political advocacy for women, unquote, which reflected the 20 plus years of fighting for women's rights prior to the 1920s. It was part of the new woman from the 1900s who participated in labor strikes, advocated for equal pay, and sought out free love and sexual agency. By the 1920s, that political charged term was diffused of its potency, and we were left with the modern girl of the 1920s. She was different from the earlier version and instead was, quote, associated with consumption, romance, and fashion, unquote. This was the flapper, the new girl, who reflected the freedom and prosperity of the era. So a lot of people associate the flapper with feminism, but when it comes to scholarship, we find that the previous era, the modern woman, was really where we see feminism emerge, and the modern girl or the flapper was, definitely a liberated woman, but nowhere near to the modern woman. She had, so this flapper or this new girl, she had, quote, cropped hair and slender fashion, making the flapper as much a symbol of modernity as a skyscraper, unquote. In other words, she was the it girl who young women desired to emulate, specifically their fun-seeking bourgeois tastes. For women in ethnic communities, films and magazines advertised this image of the modern girl to them in order to attract their attention to American mass consumer culture. In other words, they're just trying to get women to spend, right? Really doesn't have much to do with feminism. This is what it meant to be both modern and American to women in the 1920s. The flapper no longer represented the new woman who fought for workers' rights, but rather she was a product, a commodity that helped sell products to other women and was devoid of any feminist ideology from previous generations. However, it was because of these previous generations of feminists that the flapper was able to engage in this new material culture. Young Mexican American women coming of age in the 1920s worked, taking an industrial or service sector job after the 8th grade, thus contributing to the family wage economy. Though they, the flapper, did not make much money, they would follow the latest styles or read the latest gossip by watching films or reading magazines that highlighted middle class and affluent lifestyles. Advertising during this period targeted the desires and emotions of a new generation, focusing on products that were not needed but rather desired. Though you might not be able to live like Greta Garbo, Clara Bow, or Dolores del Rio, you can certainly hope to look like her, and why not? Hollywood was literally right by East Los Angeles, where many of these young Mexican American women lived. Many of them actually did try to go into the movies since it was so close. A major dilemma that these women faced was whether to quote unquote bob or not to bob, which challenged the traditional hairstyles of Mexican women who wore it long. What makeup their favorite stars were advertising or going out of the neighborhood outside the prying eyes of parents, such as to the boardwalk in Santa Monica or Long Beach, or even to the jazz clubs on Central Avenue. Though Mexican American women found empowerment through consumer culture, their parents were not too keen on the changes that were taking shape. As noted earlier in this lecture, many migrants tried to maintain their home patria alive while living in the US. They did not see themselves as quote-unquote Americans, but rather as citizens from their home of origin, living temporarily in the US while conditions in their home country improved, to hopefully one day return with their families back to their to the motherland. However, for those that had young children that were coming of age in the US, they saw American culture as corrupting their children. For Mexican families living in California, they saw their kids leave the edges of the barrio and enter a new American world, which they feared would corrupt them. For example, Mexican nationals living in the US would taunt and label their daughters pelonas, which referenced their bobbed hair, because of their assimilation into American culture, thus becoming, or at least seeing them as sellouts. The Spanish-speaking press wrote many articles about the scenarios of women. Note that these stories were referencing both young daughters and wives of Mexican men. So many of these scenarios of women who did not conform to traditional culture. Through these articles, we see the anxieties that Mexican men encountered with their daughters and partners participating in mass popular culture. In the parody story Todo se arregla con money, a husband complained to the newspaper editor that his wife spends too much time working, ignoring her wifely duties of cooking, cleaning, and spending time with him. In turn, the editor talks to the wife, where she replies with a chart of all the time she has spent with her husband, and in regards to home duties, she tells him that her husband can hire a service to complete those tasks. In turn, the editor leaves but returns on a different day to talk to her. On the second encounter, he sees her kissing her boss and he questions her behavior. In turn, she shows him how all those kisses have amounted to a $10,000 bonus in her salary. And when her husband learns about the affair, he tells her, quote, "You are the best wife. God bless you," unquote. The purpose of the story is a critique of La Pelona, who is dishonest and is straddling the fine line between a modern girl, right, the flapper, and a prostitute. In another story, Cosas del Exhibition Day, the writer Julio Arce critiques the fashion of La Pelona, who seeks attention through her sexual suggestive modern attire, to the point that the women's clothing gets ripped apart in a comical event. Ultimately, in this story, it is the woman's own fault because she had succumbed to the modern attire that is all-consuming. And the last story I want to share from this chronicle is La Estenógrafa, where the protagonist hires the Pelona to be a stenographer. In this story, the stenographer, La Pelona, she arrives wearing her flapper fashion and only changes to workplace attire at work because she wants to be seen by society with her costume on. The biggest issue that her employer has is with her use of Spanglish because she uses quote unquote made up words, which in turn he mocks her by calling her Miss Pink. Because her name is Rosa, and this translation essentially describes her as an assimilated Mexican American woman. So what do we make of these critiques? What we are essentially seeing is that young Mexican American women are facing both challenges of the natural Americanization process, where material culture provides a sense of liberation and agency, but at the same time, she becomes the target of criticism due to her lacking the values of traditional Mexican culture. And a quote performer of a wannabe white modernity, criticized for embracing an already appropriated otherness, unquote. In October of 1929, Spanish newspapers celebrated the end of an era as they believed that flaperismo, as they called it, had essentially died. One author noted, quote, "Each day the tomboy, the flapper, because she looks like a boy to them, is less popular," unquote. Therefore, hoping that Mexican American women would return to their, quote, "feminine nature and rewarded with a loving husband and happy homemaking," unquote. While we have these women struggling with their identity within a racialized world, there were other women that had no problem conforming to these expected gender roles. So here you see some picture of flappers, right? And this is a picture of Mexican American women in the 1920s. This is a wedding, but you see the fashion of a flapper, right? Everything from the hat, the hair. I mean, some of these women still have it long, but some of them have them short, right? And then the clothing, right? As one writer wrote, described it as tomboyish. You could see that it doesn't really give much shape to the women's body. And this is very kind of common in 1920s fashion. By the 1930s, fashion kind of conforms to the women's bodies, right? Giving those curves. Here, it's very straight, and hence why they have these kind of stereotypes and describing them as tomboyish or, very kind of loose clothing. And you can see how short these dresses are, right? So let's continue. So you just heard me address flapper culture and again the struggle that Mexican American women, but many ethnic women also went through that experience of assimilating into American consumer culture. And it's always a give and take. But then you see another group of women that were not too kind of happy with the migration that was happening to the United States in the 1920s. So the book mentions this, but we're going to look at women of the KKK right here. You see some kind of pictures, newspaper articles, and I'll address all these topics in a minute. So as the textbook noted, white supremacy and the Ku Klux Klan had reemerged in the 1920s stronger than before. I will not go into great detail of this movement because the textbook touches on it, but I do want to address the women of the KKK in the 1920s, as this subject is rarely talked about in U.S. history classes. In fact, it is much more interesting than studying the male version, as these women had more ambitious and realistic goals than the men. As you read in the textbook, the passage of the 19th Amendment had a major impact for all women, and they took the opportunity to practice this new freedom that they had been fighting for generations. Though it was a major step forward, it was noted that when Alice Paul chained herself to the, quote, White House fence to promote an equal rights amendment to the U.S. Constitution, several women opposed it, unquote. It would seem like a no-brainer for women to support such legislation. But the question is, who were these women who seemed to vote against their very own interests? It's always fascinating, right? That something's supposed to help women, but you have women that don't support it. So this is an example of that. So let's talk about these women. The KKK had a resurgence due to a few reasons. First, Black migration from the South into northern urban centers, along with migration from Eastern European countries, caused fear among whites, particularly after World War I, as propaganda helped spur in this fear of foreigners. The KKK did not hide like before, but used white supremacy as a tool to help recruit new members, and even going as far as hoping to establish a, quote, clan college, I would say clown college, to teach the children of loyal Klan parents, unquote. So why would women join such an organization? Well, the answer is rooted in the age of the Roaring Twenties, as women became more independent and gained suffrage. Many KKK women used many of the national issues of the era to promote a white Protestant sense of motherhood. Their goal was to protect women and children, to preserve home and family life, and to demonstrate newly won women's rights. Yet they used that rhetoric of the new woman to increase recruitment by absorbing many members from patriotic societies who were already overtly patriotic and help transition them into the women's KKK. So you have examples like this even today. Organizations, not so much like the KKK, but what is it, Mothers for Liberty or something like that? Again, that use that idea of the home, right? Oh, we got to protect the children from these things and protect the home and traditional values and blah, blah, blah. And what? They vote, right? They have entered politics, they have entered school boards and stuff like that. So this is what we see happening in the 1920s, right? And way back when. So many of these women, these KKK women, were able to basically use this ideology of white supremacy to attract some of these activists from different periods. They might have been older women, but they were still activists, and they joined the KKK. In fact, some members came from the old Prohibition movement, such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, along with the Republican and Democratic Party, such as the Delaware Republican Women's Club, among other state parties. So it didn't really matter political affiliation, right? Because it was there were members from both political parties at this time. Although they used this newfound freedom, they actually promoted the opposite, as their main concern was not with gaining independence, but rather feared losing their economic position, not because they feared losing their personal job, but rather feared that their husbands were going to lose their economic opportunities to foreigners. Therefore, they themselves losing their class status at home and seeing the decay of quote unquote American values. So this anti-feminist rhetoric was often supported by the very feminist efforts that they gained in the 1900s and the 1910s. This is just like such irony, right? The WKKK formed their own organization, and though it was hierarchical like the men and used much of the same racist ideals as theirs, these women groups were independent, setting their own agenda and objectives all throughout the U.S. In fact, many women joined without the support of their husbands and would sometimes encourage their husbands to join the male version, thus showing that these women were taking an active role and asserting their agency. These camellias, as you see in the title of this, as they called themselves, linked, quote, racist, nationalistic zeal to a specific gendered notion of the preservation of family life and women's rights, unquote. So their focus was on preserving a white supremacist ideology in their community, and they did this by solidifying their membership and leading assaults against non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant businesses, unlike their male counterparts, which were often involved in terrorist activities. These camellias engaged in orchestrated rallies, festivals, and recreational events such as a quote day-long carnival of sport and song, followed by twilight parade throughout the town, a cross burning, and an evening series of lectures and speeches in a field outside of town, unquote. For example, in Indiana, 3,000 Klan women paraded through their downtown with, quote, floats, decorated autos, lady horseback riders, marching hosts, while all the people wearing the white robe and marks of the KKK, mothers with sleeping babies in their arms, marched with the others, and the American flag was given a prominent place, unquote. And here you can kind of see some of that, right? It says some kind of burial, some kind of funeral. So what the Klan does is that these women constructed a cultural element labeled clannishness, where they created, quote, rite of passages such as Klan weddings, christening ceremonies, and funeral services, unquote, for Klan sisters. So here you see, right, a Klan funeral. And again, they're creating a culture around this concept of clannishness, this is all kind of really odd because these are all rituals that were linked to other religious organizations, such as the Catholic Church, which is what they were opposing, right? So they're taking elements from these, from these organizations that they hate and implementing it into their kind of culture here. By creating such a culture, though, it allowed members to be tied to the movement through a quote-unquote common sense mentality where these rituals seem normal and American. Secondly, another way that they hoped to promote white supremacy was through reform that reflected the values of the Klan. For example, they visited schools and handed out Bibles or copies of the Ten Commandments, attempted to have Catholic teachers fired from public schools positions, push for racial segregation of schools, along with Klan women running for school board seats to implement the Klan's program of Americanization and make Protestantism the public school religion. Such action hoped to institute white supremacy in the fabric of American society, particularly for future generations, and have a much larger impact rather than attacking specific people. Right, so this, again, the women KKK was probably, I don't want to use this word, but more progressive than the male KKK. Progressive in the sense that they had long-term goals here. So such a philosophy continued with voter registration drives, lobbying voters, distributing scandal sheets on non-Klan candidates, such as insinuating that these non-Klan candidates were either Catholic or Jewish. These poison squads, as they were known, worked to spread gossip and rumors and help gain political power for the Klan. Other tactics that these Klan women engaged in was boycotting Jewish or Catholic-owned businesses and newspapers, which were successful in small towns. In addition, they would use coded words to promote certain businesses that align with their white supremacist ideology by using words like 100% dry cleaners or 100% grocers or photo studios. Or they contain the word TWK, trade with a Klansman. Under this realm of domesticity, these Klan women were able to accomplish a lot more for their cause than those that sought, quote, open displays of physical violence and intimidation. In other words, the men, right? Truly, they utilized the politics and tools of feminism of the late 19th and early 20th century and used them for their cause that promoted a, quote, right-wing agenda of racism and bigotry, unquote. As much as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants fought to maintain control of social, economic, and political institutions, the fact was that the times were changing. And we can see this clearly with the way popular music shifted from the 1910s to the 1920s, producing the name of the era as the Jazz Age. So as we just saw, right, you have these white supremacist organizations that are trying to, take America back, right? It's always kind of noted. But America was changing. And even though I'm going to talk about the Jazz Age, and to some it might feel like, well, it looks like those Klan women lost. Not necessarily, okay? So pay attention. This is the last content slide that addresses jazz. But again, we're going to dig a little bit deeper here when it comes to this genre of music. As you can see, thus far, we have encountered a lot of clash and contradiction when it comes to defining the 1920s, along with trying to understand what is something that we can call American. As one scholar argued, jazz is and remains America's only original contribution of a new form to the musical world, as well as a wholly African-American form, unquote. We have seen a lot of tug and pull when it comes to the construction of a national identity, and this lecture has challenged many misperceptions of our past. So is there something that we can call American? Well, the closest thing might be jazz. The origins of jazz are a topic of hot debate, and it will probably never be settled. Some have argued that it was heavily influenced by Caribbean and even Mexican music. There's an article at the end of this lecture that proposes that. While many have noted the impact of the slave system in the African continent has had on ragtime, that genre of music that emerged in the 1900s, and the blues, and even on jazz. Researcher Lawrence Gushee noted that New Orleans was the center of this genre. With the migration of African Americans to northern cities, it was only natural for music to come along for the trip. However, this music would be something unique and something that we can truly call American, as it dominated the culture of the era, so much so that Chicago became the jazz capital of the US. Though African Americans encountered racism and segregation in the North, they still saw it as a place of opportunity, particularly because their music gained national attention. Jazz spread from the urban centers of places such as Los Angeles, New York, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, and Chicago to quickly enter the homes of ethnic whites, along with young adults that sought to challenge the traditional Victorian values and saw themselves as quote-unquote white Negroes, to, quote, revolt against the established social order, unquote. With the introduction of the record player along with the radio, race records dominated sales. And by race records, we mean records that were produced by African Americans. It was noted that in Chicago, quote, colored people would form a line twice around the block when the latest records of Bessie or Ma or Clara or Mammy came in, unquote. These race records were highly sought after, with black Pullman porters often operating as importers of records from city to city, allowing them to gain a few extra dollars. So these porters would work in the railroad tracks. Basically, they work on the trains, and they would commute from one city to another. And they had extra money. They would go buy something and then bring it back to their home. And some of them found that they can make a little extra money by bringing goods that were foreign to that city with some of these trips that they took. Again, by trips I mean they were working on these trains. With the introduction of the radio, people throughout the U.S. no longer needed to wait for the latest records, but could turn on the radio to hear both local and national talent, along with the latest styles. Artists such as Ferdinand Jelly Roll Morton, Joe King Oliver, and Benny Moten, along with others, became part of the American mainstream. These are famous African-American jazz performers. As noted earlier, the format of radio was never really set in the early 1920s, and as radio took off, order and structure was constructed in order to make sure that talent was compensated for their music playing over the radio waves. While white jazz musicians unionized and were able to gain the benefits of getting paid for their music in radio programming, black musicians were left with little compensation. Though many were able to play live in studio or of local stations or from remote clubs where they were performing, their pay was minimal. It was noted that Duke Ellington's manager, Irvin Mills, would take, quote, 1/2 of his profits, and he automatically owned 50% of everything he wrote while under contract, unquote. For many African American jazz artists, though they did not make a lot of money, many saw these limited opportunities as a major stepping stone towards success as they gained national attention. However, such publicity also made them open to attack, particularly from white critics, really from the white press, that sought to both limit its popularity while attacking black identity. From the get-go, white critics titled their articles such as "Unspeakable Jazz Must Go" or "Students in Arms Against Jazz." Another one was "Why Jazz Sends Us Back to the Jungle." And one final article was "The Jazz Problem," just to name a few, often categorizing the genre with primitivism, and exploited black stereotypes in order to attack the infiltration of this mass commercial music along with black migration into white spaces. Often, the attacks were focused more on African American people rather than the music itself, as magazine companies hired a varying amount of writers to make sense of this growing trend. In fact, they often tried to argue that jazz was a bastard form of European music plagiarized by African Americans. Other times, they linked it to savagery by stating, quote, "seem infected with a virus" that they tried to instill as a stimulus in others. They shake and jump and wither in ways to suggest a return to the medieval jumping mania, unquote. Another critic wrote, quote, "It is strict rhythm without melody. Today the jazz bands take popular tunes and rag them to death to make jazz. The music of contemporary savages taunts us with a lost art of rhythm," unquote. Though these examples focus on the music itself, other critics focus on the musicians, labeling them, quote unquote, monkeys, quote unquote, wild African tribes, cannibals. They said they were overly aggressive, quote unquote, even retarded. And they even advocated for the lynching of African Americans for spreading this music. Understand that this is under the context of the Red Summer of 1919, where at least 83 black men, women, and children were lynched, and hundreds were killed, injured, and over 1,000 families were made homeless. So throughout the United States, there were all these kind of, I guess they were called race riots, but really it was white people attacking African Americans in places like Chicago and other parts of the United States. So this terminology kind of fit into that rhetoric of how white people felt about African Americans. As jazz took hold in the American consciousness by the 1920s, these white critics focused more on the impact it would have on white youth. As one writer noted, quote, the serious situation is the plight of whites, especially white American youth, becoming, in some sense, too black, with the blame laid on jazz music and its evil influence on the young people of today, unquote. That kind of reminds me of, rap back in the 1990s when it went mainstream. It's almost like the same type of critique. By 1924, though, the sentiment towards jazz was changing since, quote, a number of jazz musicians were by this time white, and jazz was no longer seen as so severe a problem and may even be enjoyed, unquote. Indeed, it was the, quote, white, commercially successful dance bands such as Ben Bernie, Vincent Lopez, and Paul Whiteman, the self-proclaimed king of jazz, that were regularly featured on the airwaves, unquote. Their form of jazz was more palatable to white audiences, as it was more, quote-unquote, sweetened and a more, quote-unquote, swinging form of jazz where it was finally culturally acceptable to white audiences and viewed as a respectable form of art. As the decade came to an end, America was at a crossroads as to what it represented to different communities. Jazz was something that brought many people together, particularly those who were first generation young and seeking to leave the limitations of their neighborhood. In fact, if there was anything that we can call roaring during the 1920s, it was the sound of jazz coming out of the clubs in both black and white neighborhoods. And here you see some pictures of some of the jazz bands, right? Here you have a white band, but then here you have African Americans, right, performing jazz also. But when it becomes, I guess, appropriated, right, then it becomes accepted. So let's conclude this lecture. Before I move to the conclusion, I want to address some of these readings. So as you can see, there's a long list of different articles that were used, and you're welcome to take a look at some of these through our database called JSTOR. They are accessible to all students, and if you ever do research, it's a great database to use, which you can access through the EMCC website. So let's kind of conclude this this lecture, and address some of the major points that were presented. So first, as we noted in this lecture, there was economic growth, right? We cannot deny that. And I'm not saying that that did not happen. As I noted with the president's policies, they were focusing on cutting taxes and so forth. But understand that the majority of Americans did not benefit from many of these policies. That has not changed. We saw this a few years ago when certain tax policy was passed. Yes, it did benefit people, but not to the extent that it benefits a certain class. So it was no different in the 1920s. And I gave you statistics, I gave you numbers, particularly that impacted the average American citizen, which at this time made the majority of the population, or at least your average person living in America at this time. So we challenged that concept of the Roaring 20s as a time of economic growth that trickled down to everybody. Another kind of major argument that was noted is this notion of the melting pot, right? As Americans, we have always been taught that America is a melting pot. And it's the stories from about the 1920s that have kind of constructed this myth of the melting pot. And what you have seen, again, looking at research, looking at resources, has shown that the majority of these ethnic immigrants, again, your great-great-grandparents or grandparents or so forth, right, that came to America in the 1900s, early 1900s, did not actually assimilate into American culture, but rather try to maintain their culture as much as possible. So yeah, some of them bought some of these consumer goods, and definitely women were impacted by it, but many of them try to maintain their culture. If anything, it's not an assimilation period, it's rather an acculturation era, where migrants are negotiating aspects of American culture at this time. So again, this concept of a melting pot did not really take shape at this time. It's really, I think most historians, I know Elizabeth Cohen argues that it's actually in the 1930s where you have this melting pot come about, which challenges the way this is typically presented. And then lastly, we see how consumer culture did not really allow for some agency. We noted, again, women utilize, flapper culture and consumer culture. We see KKK women, right, utilize, um, the benefits of suffrage to try to meet their agenda. However, it was often limited, or many times consumer culture was utilized and redefined under the terms of the consumer. And we see this with the immigrant communities living in places like Chicago and New York and these major cities that use consumer culture, but really they use it to reaffirm who they are. Particularly their identity that is tied to their mother country. It would take another generation. It's really their kids that will probably become more American as the decades move forward. So by the 1950s, that's where you really kind of see this really melting pot theory really take shape. As I said a second ago, right? It's the 1930s where it really begins, but it's the 1950s where this kind of middle class generation really takes hold of American identity. But even then, you still see people listening to their Italian songs and so forth, right? So I hope you feel that you walk away learning something new. I'm not sure if it challenges what you've been taught, but we definitely dig a lot deeper than the textbook and the way we are typically taught about this era. So make sure to complete the quiz and have a good day. Bye.